Hello. We're gonna do our live video for the Phoebe Quiltalong this week, and I'm gonna give people a couple of minutes to get on here. This is gonna be probably one of the shorter videos for the Quiltalong because piecing of the block is not complicated and it's pretty quick to explain. So I did ask for questions and I have a few. If you have any questions during the video, post them in the comments. And because this is probably going to be a shorter-ish video, you can ask about, doesn't have to be about piecing or this week's thing, you can ask whatever, and I will try to answer. I'm going to give people a couple more minutes to get on. Do you guys want to see my next two patterns? How do I turn this around? So I've kind of shared a little bit about both of these. These are my next two patterns. Sorry, this is my lamp. This is the Verity quilt, and it will be my next pattern, and actually it's probably going to be pretty quick. I actually had intended to have this pattern come out before Ruby, and I just didn't get the cover quilt done and photographed in time, so I did Ruby first. So this one will probably actually be in a couple of weeks. So, and then after that, I have the Stella quilt, which I'm very excited about. My thing that I'm most proud of about this quilt is that it is fat quarter friendly. So for the lap size, for the larger sizes, it can use some fat quarters, but lap or baby size, fat quarter friendly. So the 4 fabrics that are, that are like the bigger zigzag, it's a little bit of a close call with cutting it from a fat quarter, but I cut these from fat quarters and I cut the cover quilt from fat quarters. So you definitely can do it. And there's a guide in the pattern to show you how to cut them to make it work. So I'm really excited about those two. And today the Ruby quilt pattern was released and is a little crazy to do it during the Quiltalong. But part of the reason why I haven't done more Quiltalongs is because they take a lot of time, which is fine. But then it makes it difficult. It disrupts my schedule. So I usually have my schedule planned out pretty far in advance. So doing a Quiltalong, and I don't usually, I guess, include a Quiltalong in the schedule because I don't always know which patterns I'm going to want to do. So it's been kind of tricky. I'm not the most organized person because you can't tell. So I'm working on it. All right, so let's talk about the Phoebe quilt block construction. And this week, we're going to just make the strips that make up the block. And then next week, part 2 of block construction, we'll sew the strips together. So this shouldn't take too long. I did all mine yesterday afternoon. Didn't take too long. It's kind of strange because I usually, once I start a quilt, I just barrel through until I'm done. So it's weird for me to work on a step and then stop. And then it makes the quilt feel like it's really quick because I'm only working on it for a little bit every week instead of working on it nonstop. So I'm going to flip the camera around and point it at my cutting table so that I can talk about the block. So here we go. All right. Look, my cutting table is clean. All right. So there are 3 different types of strips that we're going to make in this quilt to make the block. The one that will go in the middle is this piece right here. It's got a 6.5 inch piece and then a square on each side. And I do press all of my seams open 100% of the time. I almost never ever do anything else. So that is how I would recommend doing it for this quilt. I wrote on the blog post for this week a way that I think would work to get some nesting seams with this quilt. There's not a lot of places for the seams to nest, and I think it will work, but I haven't tried it. So if anybody, and I don't press my seams to the side, so I think I'll show you in a minute. All right, so that one goes in the middle. You need 1/3 of your 6.5 inch pieces for this piece. And the reason you need 1/3 is because in the block, each block you need 2 of these, and just 1 of these. So those are the piece that goes in the middle. Then you're going to need, with the rest of your 6.5 inch pieces, you're going to need to make these, which are sewn to the 4.5 inch background piece. And these are for 2/3 of the 6.5 inch piece fabric, feature fabric pieces. So you need those. And then with all of the 4.5 inch feature fabric pieces, you're going to sew them to the 6.5 inch background piece. All right, so the way that it will work with the block is that you're going to have this one in the middle, and then you're going to have, let me just make sure I orient it the same way I did in the pattern. One this way, one that goes this way. So these are the same. See, these are the same, but it's just flipped around. And then you're going to have two of these. So you'll have one of these here and one of these here. And see, these two are the same. It's just flipped around. So next week we'll sew these together. So as you can see, there's nowhere in the block that you would get a nesting seam because none of the seams match up. So if you decide to press your seams to the side and would like to get some nesting seams, this is what I think will work. Don't get mad at me if it doesn't work because I haven't tried it. If you press all of your seams toward the feature fabric at this step, and then when you piece these together, you press them all down. Actually, I think it could work either way, down or, yeah, I'm just going to tell you one way. This is what I thought about. Press them down. Then when you sew the blocks together, this seam, and I don't have a completed block. You'll have a seam here that would nest, but that is all, since there aren't a lot of seams to match, which is part of what makes this a good pattern for somebody who's a newer quilter, because it can be tricky to match seams at first, and it's easier to make a pattern that doesn't have as many seams to match up. So proceed with caution if you decide to do that, because I haven't tried it, and I don't usually like to recommend something unless I've actually done it, but I do press all of my seams open. So now I'm going to answer the questions you guys asked. All right, somebody asked, how do you make sure you're getting a scant 1/4 inch seam? First of all, a scant 1/4 inch seam, all that means is that when you sew, where's a ruler? You might think, oh, I want this measurement right here to be a 1/4 inch. But what you actually want, I don't know if you can see, it's a little bit less than a 1/4 inch. And the reason why is because the thread, the fabric, all of this, when you press, takes up some space. So if you had this be 1/4 inch, and then you had that thread and fabric take up space, you would actually use more than a 1/4 inch of fabric. Does that make sense? So what you want to have is, for after you sew it, you want it to have taken up a 1/4 inch of space. So the way to test it, and this is going to be important in this pattern, not as important as in some patterns, but you want all of your pieces to end up the same length here, exactly. And if you are off by a little bit, then they won't be the same length. So the way you test it is, I sewed this 6.5 inch piece to this 4.5 inch piece. When sewn together, they should now be exactly 10.5 inches. And if it's a little bit less than 10.5 inches, your seam allowance is just a little bit too big. And if it's a little bit more than 10.5 inches, then your seam allowance is just a little bit too small. So the way you change it is just by moving the needle position on your machine. My machine, the foot that I use for a 1/4 inch seam allowance is called the O2 foot by Janome, and it gives me a scant 1/4 inch seam. I don't have to make any adjustments. But depending on your machine, the foot you use, and sometimes even depending on how you press your fabric, or the width of your thread, or the thickness of your fabric, that can affect your seam allowance. So That's that question. Hopefully that makes sense. It's very complicated to explain, but once you understand what the point of it is, I think it makes sense. All right, so at this point, should you be thinking about block layout or just sew them together? So I don't think about block layout at this point. When I posted a picture, I had it laid out like a block, but I won't use those pieces together probably. I don't plan it at this point because I don't know. If I did plan it, I'd probably just get everything mixed up and lose track and have to redo it anyway. So what I do try to do is, because these are both 6.5 inch pieces, I try to mix them up a little bit so that I'm using a good mix of some for this type of piece and a good mix of some for this type of piece, if that makes sense. So I may not even worry about block construction until I have started piecing, because I just am not good at keeping track of everything. Like I said before, organization is not my strong point. So what you will want to, if you want to start thinking about it, you can lay everything out and start piecing them in order. And you want to think about making sure that you have a good mix of scale, color, value, and all of that. So you wouldn't want to make a block that, let's see, and we can talk about more next week. Let's see. Like, you wouldn't want a block that looked like this. See, I'm choosing all light valued prints. If you have all light value fabric, that's fine, but I don't. So I wouldn't want so many light valued prints. I'm trying to find another one in one block, because then it would look imbalanced with the other blocks. So let's say I had this one and then I had another one next to it that was all dark valued prints. Your eye would be drawn towards the darker one and it would be distracting. So, long story short, I would not worry about block layout at this point. Just sew them together, sew your strips together, and we will talk about layout. That will be the primary thing to worry about next week. How do you keep fraying down? This is going to vary a lot depending on the fabrics that you're using. This is a Ruby Star Society collection, and it doesn't fray very much. So I don't really worry about it. If you're using a woven, like let me see what I've got. Like a warp and weft. I don't know if I have any sitting around. Oh, yeah. Hold on. Okay. If you are using like a warp and weft print, these fray like crazy. So along the edge, there's just, I don't know if you can see, they fray super easily, and it's a little bit uncomfortable to see that happen. So one thing that you can do if you're having trouble with that, if your fabrics tend to be fraying a lot, you can starch your fabrics, which I never do, but I know some people swear by them, especially because sometimes fabrics that fray a lot are also more stretchy, which is true of this collection. Another thing that you can do is decrease the stitch length on your sewing machine, which is something that I do as part of, let me turn it around so you can see, of pressing my seams open anyway, is my machine defaults to a 2.2 stitch length, and I decrease it to 2.0, which is not a big difference, but it makes a big enough difference that the seams don't tend to pull apart on the edge, which can happen when you press your seams open. So find a stitch length that works for you to help keep that from happening. All right. Do I backstitch? No, I don't. Sometimes I will use a starter and an ender piece to help keep the thread from nesting underneath my block when I start sewing. But what I do more often is I really like to use the single hole needle plate, which I have a needle plate on my machine right now because I'm about to do some quilting where this is all one opening. And if you've ever had your fabric kind of get pushed down into the needle plate, that this type of needle plate will come in handy because it can help prevent that from happening. You have to be careful, I don't know if you can see, to make sure you switch back when you want to do something like a zigzag stitch, or you will cause some problems. There's some little needle marks on here. So there's a dog outside. So no, I don't backstitch, but you can if you want to. Sometimes on a quilt where the fabrics seem to be a little bit more if they have more of a tendency to fray, I will, when I'm sewing the quilt top together and maybe if the quilt's kind of heavy and I'm worried about seams pulling apart, I will backstitch at the beginning and the end of a long line, but otherwise I don't. Do I press my seams open always? Yes. I like it so much better. I like that the quilt ends up with a smoother finish. I feel like I get much better points when I press my seams open, although I've heard people say that they feel like they get better points when they press their seams to the side. But I just prefer to not have bulky seams, so I press my seams open all the time. And you want your seam, see how these are nice and even all the way across. Pinning helps with that. There's a kind of a tendency when you sew two pieces together let's say I have these two lined up like this and I'm sewing, the bottom one might kind of dip down a little bit and then your seam allowance doesn't end up quite as even. It's worth it just for that. So I do always press my seams open and I do always pin. So even though this is a short distance to sew, I still pinned it. So I think that's it. I don't think anybody had any questions. If you have a question, you can ask. I will save this video to Instagram and I will also save it to YouTube. My plan is after this Quiltalong to mostly make some videos with tips for the patterns and post those mostly on YouTube, and then I'll link to Instagram because I'm still trying to figure this out. So that's what we're doing this week. Just go ahead and get your strips pieced so that we can make the blocks next week. And if you're already looking ahead, I think we'll include cutting the blocks for the edges and the corners in the quilt top construction week. Or maybe next week, we'll see. But if you have any questions in the meantime, post them in the comments and I will try to answer.